think of it as found in Hegel, and in some sense that's one of the reasons I'm attracted to Bob's interpretation of Hegel, and in some sense it seems to me that gets it right. It's intolerance of contradictory thoughts that in some sense is the driving motor of rationality for Hegel. Saying that then, however, gives you the task of saying, well, what does Hegel mean by everything is contradictory? Because at least Graham's account gives some sort of sense to that. So I guess what I've been trying to do is give some sense to it without going as far as affirming that there could be, P and not P could be true at some P this world, and that's what Hegel means. So does that? Maybe I'm
to a large extent, but I guess
I'm sure I'm not doing justice to the presupposition at all.
Can I also just pose a question about normativity? Because it did raise the question of, well, what is the difference in our understanding of what the normative aspect of it is? Right. And it seemed to suggest that in Bob's case, normativity is more that you ought to conform to this norm when you do it. Whereas for Graham, it is a norm, but we can evaluate whether we want to follow that norm or not using it. It seems to be there's a difference in how they see that.
Right. What I sort of like about Bob's expressivist position, that it explains, well, it seems to me to explain how the law of non-contradiction could be a type of enduring logical law, but it could be a different law. I think it is different for Aristotle to what it is for modern logicians. I mean, that seems to be fairly obvious. I mean, Aristotle just doesn't really have a propositional logic, so he can't mean by it what we mean. And when you sort of start looking and try to make sense of it, you get a sense of what he does mean. And when you do that, I think you get a sense of what it is. It's essentially a sort of an ontological thesis for Aristotle, and one sense in which Hegel is, as it were, affirming. One sense in which he's denying the law of non-contradiction is that he's denying that ontological thesis of Aristotle. That to affirm that thesis would be to take the object of perception as the fundamental stuff of the universe, and that's the whole point of Hegel's traversing these sort of positions in the phenomenology to argue that can't be. So that, in that sense, I think it's clear that he believes everything is contradictory. They're not objects of Aristotelian thought. But that's a different issue to the Graham issue. Nick?
This is just a suggestion really of another recent view apart from Priest that could be relevant, which is, so you made this distinction between in term negation and propositional negation in Aristotle. So term negation is, not term negation, possessing a property versus possessing the contradictory of that property, the negation of that property. And so then this just brought to mind, that's why I'm suggesting it's something that might be relevant. So Russell had this, the famous criticism of the Meinong, where Meinong said, well, look, we can think about the golden mountain, so there must be such a thing, and then Russell's like, well, look, we can think about the round square mountain, so there must be such a thing, and this violates the law of non-contradiction. And then thinking neo-Meinongians like Zolter in particular, and this is meant to be an interpretation of Meinong, but it's certainly very clear in Zolter that there are two ways of possessing a property. So the golden mountain exemplifies, it encodes both roundness and squareness, which is something that entails the negative property of roundness. But it doesn't exemplify them both, and so this doesn't conflict with the law of non-contradiction. So that's just a suggestion of something that seems might be interesting.
Yes, but thanks for that. I mean, it's only recently that I realised that Richard Sylvan, who's into that sort of Meinongian stuff too, criticises the classical idea of negation as sentential negation. and wants to argue that negation works at the level of subsentential categories as well. So effectively, he wants to have an idea of term negation as sort of independent, as an independent form of negation to sentential negation, and I would guess that it's bound up with his sort of minority bits as well, but I just don't know the material. But so thanks for the suggestion.
Paul, we're almost out of time, but I have a small suggestion as well on the related part of your talk. It's just about your choice of examples. I mean, fortunately, it's the case that even in such a style-driven place as Sydney, it's not the case that everything that doesn't count as beautiful counts as ugly.
Yes.
There's quite a wide space in between.
Yes.
No, I mean, clearly that's not the case for all predicates, but really what you need at that point is an example of a predicate where there isn't such a wide space in between.
Yes.
Or you need to
yes.
just say not beautiful and leave ugly out of the picture.
Yeah. Not unattractive doesn't mean attractive.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, but that's the point. I mean, I think Aristotle needs the positive pole, as does Hegel. I mean, the reason I picked a sort of a normative thing there as opposed to 5 foot or something like that is that when you look at Hegel's account of judgment, the most fundamental form of judgment involves ascribing to an object a property that has a type of practical sort of relevance, right? So that is action guiding, in that sense.
But even there, I mean, as the example of beautiful and ugly makes clear, there's plenty of room for. I mean, you can have a sort of, as it were, a positive and a negative action guiding push, as it were, but then there'd be a space in the middle which contrasts with both, because it doesn't have either.
Yes, it's sort of important for Hegel that we sort of push to these extremes, because that's what gets our, let's say, what drives our discussions, right? That drives our criticisms of each other and so on.
I mean, ordinary predicate negation doesn't seem to necessarily take us from one pole to the other in those cases.
No, but predicate negation is different to term negation for Aristotle. Term negation is sort of prototypically these extreme oppositions. I mean, Aristotle talks about, spatial ones, up and down, as his sort of model, and he thinks that there's a sort of an up as far as you go and as a down. They're the sort of maximally opposed ones. So it's important for Aristotle that they have this type of polarity that's sort of driven apart. In some sense, it's important for Hegel too. I mean, what it does for both of them is make argumentation sort of rather simplistic, and it allows them to get a purchase on that type of conceptual structure. I mean, if you really wanted to do serious sort of thought about how our empirical judgments are and the sort of relations they enter into each other, of course there'd be all sorts of intermediate and fine-tuning sort of concerns. But I think they're both interested in this sort of being driven apart aspect of our dialectical encounters, because that's where you get the problems specified, the conceptual problems.
Okay, I think there are interesting issues there, because there's a sense in which there's a driving apart between, as it were, feeling a push and not feeling a push. Though it's a different sense from the sense of driving apart between feeling a push in one direction and feeling a push in the opposite direction. But there's still some kind of opposition.
Yeah, just on the sort of historical thing, Hegel certainly wants, I think, the feeling the push thing, right? So hence, often appealing to aesthetic things, which are either or I want to see more, that sort of thing.
And presumably you need to distinguish between, as it were, the push of the various sorts of astoric norms, which are in operation in association with negation and so on, and the push of it associated with some of the particular cases.
Yes. Thanks.
Good. We've now, that's a very good place to stop. So.